All right, so I believe we are live. So to everyone, welcome. My name is Nathaniel Lin. I'm Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy here in Vienna, Austria, and thank you for joining us today. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by our U.S. Embassy also in Bern and the Swiss Forum on Foreign Policy, also known as Foraus. So today we are very pleased to join Mr. Dean Cheng from the Heritage Foundation, who is a senior research fellow for Asian studies at the Heritage Foundation based in Washington, D.C., and an expert on China's military and foreign policy, in particular, its relationship with its Asian neighbors and the United States. Dean was here back in January visiting Vienna and was able to give a few talks here. So unfortunately, we're doing this virtually today in the post-COVID world. But hopefully that will allow some of you around Europe to join us as well. So the way this will work is we're going to turn it over to Dean in a bit and he'll give a talk. We have a Slido session set up, so if you want to submit any questions from the audience, please log on to the Slido and submit your questions. And after Dean's talk, our two moderators, Benno Zogg from Foraus and Thomas Seifert from the Wiener Zeitung, will be moderating the session and taking your questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dean, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just to be sure I didn't mute myself, I hope. One of the great hazards, I'm afraid, of teleconferencing and the like. So good afternoon to you in Europe. Good morning from here in the United States. My comments today are going to provide some context of how China looks at the world, looks at Europe, and in particular, what its policies are likely to be in the context of the post-COVID-19 world. To begin with, I think it's very important to provide the framing of how China looks at the world. And there are four key aspects here. The first is that China, of course, is an Asian nation. In this context here, what is particularly important is that China comes out of a very different historical background and experience than that of the United States or Europe, which is to say that European foreign policy for most of the last several centuries, but certainly throughout the 20th, was rooted in the idea of balance of power. There were multiple powers constantly shifting and realigning, forging counterweights whenever a single dominant hegemon, Napoleonic France, Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, or the Soviet Union, was rising up to try and dominate all of Europe. This is very different from the Chinese. Chinese foreign policy has always enjoyed the reality that it was the single dominant power in Asia, and it was surrounded not by other major powers seeking to balance it, but far smaller powers that were tributary states. So Chinese concepts of foreign policy, molded over several thousand years, has no real history of balance of power for most of that time. This is one of the reasons why the century of humiliation is important, because that is the one period when China went from being the dominant hegemon of Asia to being the so-called weak man of Asia. For 100 years, roughly from 1839 to 1949, China was in fact at the mercy of outside powers, whether it was Japan, Europe, Great Britain, which started the Opium Wars, Russia, or of course, the United States. And in this context, we therefore also need to recognize that not only is China therefore an Asian nation coming out of an Asian non-European context, but that it is also not a rising power in the sense that Imperial Germany was a rising power. Instead, it is a returning power. It is a nation that had been laid low that is now coming back to the fore. And this, again, is a very different context. You often hear how China is sort of like Imperial Germany, and I think that it's very important to recognize that that is simply not the case. And it is no accident, for example, that Xi Jinping's China dream is about the great revival of the Chinese people. It is a return of a great power to its traditional place over thousands of years. The third aspect is that there is no civil society in China. For those of us in the West, Europe, the United States, we value civil society. We believe in the idea of a realm outside that of politics, political influence, political power, non-governmental organizations, religious organizations, sports organizations. These are seen as separate from politics. Those nations that lived under the Soviet Union during the Cold War, of course, saw civil society eroded to varying extents. One of the key things to think about here is the role of the Catholic Church in Poland in keeping alive the idea of a realm outside that of the state or the government. The People's Republic of China is a Marxist-Leninist state. The ruling entity is the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party is these days very much a Leninist vanguard party. It is the only source of political power within the PRC, but it is also a Marxist-Leninist state that therefore discourages and actively suppresses civil society. There is no organization or entity within China that is considered beyond the reach of the CCP. In fact, the Chinese themselves say that wherever there are 3 Chinese people, there should be a party member present. Whether it is religion, whether it is non-governmental organizations, which in China are actually almost always tied back to the government, whether it is social media, there is nothing beyond the reach of the CCP. And that also, of course, therefore applies to things like private companies, to key industries, to the entire banking sector. Even if they are not specifically state-owned enterprises, they are nonetheless going to heed state direction. And China has gone to the trouble of actually creating entire legal structures, the national security law, the cybersecurity law, the anti-terrorism laws, that basically say that, for example, all data is liable to be subpoenaed, if you will, by the Chinese state, and all entities, businesses, governmental organizations, so-called non-governmental organizations, etc., are required to honor Chinese governmental requests or demands for that information. Finally, the last of the 4 key aspects to think about here is that China is not a rule of law society. It is a rule by law society. Throughout thousands of years of Chinese history, no independent judiciary ever evolved. The Chinese system has never had a separation of powers as we tend to think of it in the West. So it's not just a matter of civil society, but it is also how you look at things like the law. The law in China is an instrumentality. It is a means by which those in power can require compliance. It is not a separate fact-finding or arbitration aspects, such as certainly English common law, the roots of American law is based upon that. Sorry, my apologies. The result is that the Chinese officials at international organizations. My apologies. This is we have a bit of interference here. There we go. So Chinese officials, for example, at international organizations are Chinese first, unlike Western officials who basically take an oath to be impartial and to put the interests of the organization first. So there is video of Chinese officials from the UN openly talking about suppressing, for example, the presence of Uyghurs who are legally acceptable at a UN body because I am a Chinese official, I am here, that I will not allow them to color or bias the proceedings of this international organization. This is a very different view, obviously, of the role of law, the rule of law, the rule by law, and that applies, again, to both international as well as domestic conduct. All of this plays to certain Chinese policy advantages. They have very persistent policy goals. I'm not sure that they actually think a century ahead, despite some folks making that claim. But it is certainly clear that once the Chinese establish plans, those plans remain in place, and they're typically not tied to presidential, congressional, or parliamentary elections. And that allows the Chinese to plan ahead. And this is complemented by the reality that China has very consistent funding. They have programmatic stability, which means that whether it is space programs, 5G development efforts, et cetera, China can support its long-term projects with consistent funding efforts, which again is a significant contrast to more democratic systems. All of this means that the PRC and the United States in particular are shaping a very different set of competitive behaviors. I would suggest that the PRC and the United States are already in a new international competition. This is not another Cold War. I want to emphasize that. Because to begin with, it is not zero-sum. The Chinese, unlike the Soviet Union, are much more multifaceted. The Soviets really could only compete in terms of military power, of which they had a global reach. China, while its military is modernizing, is less of a global military power, and is certainly a regional military power. But also China competes across what it terms comprehensive national power. It competes in terms of military to some extent, but it also competes in terms of economics, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of political influence, in terms of science and technology, even in terms of culture. In this regard, the Soviets were much more monochromatic. It also means, because of the trade and economic aspect, that the US-China relationship and China's relationship with much of the rest of the world is not entirely zero-sum, although Chinese economic behavior is increasingly looking mercantilist. So a better comparison might be to the pre-World War I great power rivalries, but now heightened and deepened by aspects such as information technology, and especially 5G, which China does see as the key to the future. This puts us into the issue of Chinese goals. China very clearly has been thinking about the post-COVID-19 world. It has very clear strategic goals and objectives looking out into the future. Perhaps the single most important is keeping Taiwan in a box. And what we have seen in terms of Chinese influence at the WHO, above all else, was to keep Taiwan in a box, to ignore Taiwanese authorities' warnings about COVID-19, prevent Taiwan from participating in the World Health Organization, World Health Assembly. In fact, if there is anything that the Chinese are worried about post-COVID-19, it is that their behavior has opened the diplomatic space for Taiwan. A second is maintaining China's place in global supply chain. China has clearly worked very hard over the last several months to present itself as a good partner, a reliable supplier, a skilled workforce. This is one of the key reasons why the Chinese are very, very unhappy with references to it, to the disease as Chinese flu, and insist that they have no responsibility for failures in personal protective equipment that China has provided either as an export or as aid. And finally, China is clearly trying to reshape global political norms and industrial standards. The new generation of wolf warrior diplomats very clearly seek to define how we think and what we can say about China. Sadly, we see this specifically in the context of Europe, with how the Chinese influenced European Executive External Action Service, EEAS's report on Chinese disinformation, and the outright censorship of the letter co-authored by a group of European ambassadors that was supposed to appear in the Chinese press. This touches on multiple aspects. The Chinese press is not independent. The Chinese very clearly feel that they have a right as a returning power to dictate how people think. This is China returning to its traditional place, if you will. So within this context, I think it's important again to note, China has a broad, comprehensive approach. It has used PPE to try and shape international opinion, especially European opinion. I would suggest that much of this is about 5G, trying to reshape how Europe thinks about China as a partner for 5G. It very much wants to be building that infrastructure, and there are very clear security implications of that. I have to go into that during Q&A. But this is not limited to high technology. Made in China 2025 talked about microchips and manufacturing and information and communications technology, but also included railways, agricultural machinery, power generation as key areas that China wanted to lead the world in its production. And China Standards 2035 is a continuation of that effort now to influence global standards in terms of economics and development. Europe needs to recognize that it is a major, but not the only, battleground from China's perspective. Chinese SOEs are clearly pushing to play a role in Europe with the Belt and Road Initiative and the Italian agreement to sign an MOU, but Europe is alongside Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. China is battling the US for control of the narrative around the world, including in Europe, but also in Africa and the Middle East and Southeast Asia. It's important to note here, China is not out to conquer the world. The Chinese are not looking to have occupation forces on every street corner, whether in Seoul or London or Boston, but it would like to see self-censorship. It would like to see people recognize that challenging China is dangerous because it could lead to reductions in trade, in imports, in exports, in investment opportunities. So let me conclude here by noting China poses a fundamentally different challenge to any faced by the West in the past 2 centuries. China is a system, the People's Republic of China is a system that has a worldview fundamentally different from Europe, employing very different tools and different mechanisms. It is a challenge posed by a whole of society, not just a whole of government approach, partly because of Chinese history, but partly because of the Marxist-Leninist nature of the CCP. It is a challenge that includes corporate, academic, media, as well as military and financial elements. And finally, that the PRC does indeed pose a challenge to fundamental Western principles. Rule of law, individual rights, freedom of expression. These are all things that the PRC does not believe in. There is little evidence that it is evolving towards that there is the kind of political liberalization that we had hoped for, or that China is likely to allow this to exist elsewhere because it will eventually impinge upon and lead to criticism of the PRC itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean. I think you laid some brilliant groundwork for the discussion. Let me briefly introduce myself. I'll be one of your 2 co-moderators this afternoon. My name is Benno Zogg. I'm sitting in Zurich. I'm co-head of the Peace and Security Program with Foraus, the Swiss think tank in foreign policy, which is unique in the sense that it's a volunteer-based grassroots which allows lots of people to participate in bringing ideas to foreign policy. And I'm also a senior researcher at the Security Studies at Zurich, which is a very interesting as well. Let me start the discussion with a question that you laid a lot of very, very broad groundwork, elaborating China's posture in general, self-image, but also how it relates to the US, very different from our understanding. You particularly call Europe a major platform in this kind of competition that is going on. So given I myself am sitting in Switzerland, my co-moderator is seated in Austria, where does this Europe, and within it in particular, where does this small country with and also are there just between a rock and a hard place, passive receivers of all these developments, or is there any kind of role small states play, or are they shaped? I'll be very curious.
So we have, unfortunately, significant insight into how China thinks about smaller countries. At the 2011 ASEAN Regional Forum, I believe it was, when then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton proposed offered the good offices of the U.S. to help mediate South China Sea disputes. If you sort of remember, this is before the Chinese began building islands in the middle of the ocean. Yang Jiechi, now state counselor for foreign affairs, then the foreign minister, disappeared for about an hour. We think he went actually back to the embassy. This was in Hanoi. Went to the Chinese embassy and cabled for instructions and came back and basically sat down and went on a remarkable diatribe, not just against the United States, but against the other ASEAN countries, and basically wagged his finger. I mean, he didn't take off his shoe and pound the podium. I think he had a little more sense of that. But basically said there are big countries and there are small countries, and that is just a fact of life. And he did that looking directly at the ambassador from Singapore. And I think that the implicit message here, which again goes back into a groove, a learned set of behaviors that has lasted thousands of years, is China is a great power. Everyone else among its neighbors are relatively smaller powers, and therefore they must obey. This is a fundamentally different view than what we have learned from 2 world wars in Europe, and more importantly, sort of the broader aspects of, I won't call it democracy, but sort of whether it's the League of Nations or the United Nations General Assembly, a recognition that at some level everyone is equal. No, Austria, Switzerland, Finland are not major powers. They do not have nuclear weapons, at least none that we know of. But nonetheless, they have a voice and a right to be heard as co-equals to a Germany, a Great Britain, or a United States. And China very clearly does not seem to feel that way. And I think that how it behaved in the middle of COVID-19 is a good example of this. It refused to allow the WHO in. It has generally refused to answer questions about its own behavior, despite the fact that that has global impact. And it has had few compunctions about sending, frankly, defective equipment abroad and expecting to be thanked for it. These are the actions of a major imperial power towards subjects, not a co-equal, albeit a much larger co-equal, towards other countries. So I think that this is part of that challenge, is how, I don't think it's quite between a rock and a hard place. The United States is a giant galumping elephant in a china shop, not even a bull, but a bull elephant, if you will. We are clumsy. We do things sometimes without thinking, sometimes with malice, I have to admit. But in the main, our principles do demand that we at least try, that we at least give lip service to the idea of equality, something that I'm not sure China does at all.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is Thomas Seifert speaking now from Vienna again. I'm Deputy Editor-in-Chief with the Wiener Zeitung, by the way, the oldest newspaper still in print. We exist since 1703. And I have also a question you already touched upon, the strategic implications for Europe. And in this, you didn't say it's not a Cold War, you said, but it's definitely rivalry and competition. And of course, Europe is in a different place than the United States. We are no Pacific power, the United States is, but we share the same landmass, the same Eurasian landmass with China. So there is actually a train service from Germany, even from Portugal, to all the way to Shanghai and to the very east of China. And of course, that makes this changes things significantly. And also, Europe doesn't have an appetite to be, again, a pawn in a new Cold War, if there ever is one, that like we were. And the other question is, China behaves differently, you said, in many ways. And we remember, at least people like myself who are generation 89, let's say, born in 68, that there was a red book in Europe, people running around with Mao's Bible, so to speak. And of course, the Russians, the Soviets at that time, tried to influence ideology. And as you said yourself, China does not. China has other interests. So maybe you want to try to untangle a little bit what this means for Europe from where you sit from a vantage point in Washington, D.C. in the United States. How do you view this position that Europe is in between what you said, the China shop and the elephant. I mean, two big powers, and Europe is kind of caught in between geographically, but also maybe in the future in a strategic sense.
I think that certainly China does not pose a military threat at the present time to Europe, certainly not in the traditional land, sea, and air domains. The Chinese military is largely regional. That being said, we see Chinese activities in key domains of international common spaces. Here I'm talking about the outer space realm and the information realm, which is cyber, but it's more than just cyber. And there we see a China that does in fact pose a fundamental challenge, not just to the United States and its neighbors, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Vietnam, but to Europe. When we, for example, look at Chinese behavior in the cyberspace realm, where there are no borders, being on the same continent and the same landmass does not mean that China has treated Europe better. If anything, we see China behaving towards Europe the same way it behaves towards the United States and others. There's something called border gateway protocols. It basically is the air traffic control system for the internet. A couple of scholars, one from our Naval War College, one from Tel Aviv University, have documented how China has fundamentally redirected portions of global internet traffic to China. Essentially, imagine if you were flying to Chicago, but somehow your luggage was directed by air traffic control to Beijing, where it could then be recorded and examined before it flew on to Chicago. That is essentially what the Chinese have done via the border gateway protocol. The reason why I bring this up in the context of your question is we now have documented evidence that the Chinese have done BGP interference with European traffic. That this is not just North American traffic, internet traffic that has been redirected, but European internet traffic, traffic within Europe has been redirected to China. This is fundamentally violating multiple norms and standards because the entire concept of the internet, the reason why we have these air traffic control signals, of which China is part of that network, is the idea that people wouldn't take advantage of this to redirect traffic and then record it or break into it. So this is one aspect. The other thing to keep in mind here is when we look at China and India, and lately there's been a lot of tension, we now have had some deaths on the Sino-Indian border. This reflects the idea that whether or not Europe or India is looking for a fight doesn't mean that China is not. And whether it is the cyber realm or the space realm, this is one of the great worrisome aspects, is that Chinese behavior eventually spills over. So I don't think we're looking at a Cold War, but I think we may be looking at a very cold peace. A situation where we have trade, but that trade is increasingly under pressure. Where we have interactions, but those interactions are increasingly constrained. And where Europe may or may not be forced to choose by the United States. We are putting a lot of pressure on a number of European countries, particularly with regards to 5G. But we also see a China that is increasingly pushing Europe and others to not comment on human rights issues. And the latest revelations about China's behavior towards Uyghurs is something that is frankly outrageous. Towards intellectual property theft, towards behavior in key regions such as the South China Sea, which may not affect Europe directly from a military sense. But when $5.3 trillion of trade passes through that area, pressure on it eventually affects Europe as much as it affects the United States or the Middle East.
Dean, I already have a follow-up question on Slido that just came in, because you mentioned India, and actually there's a good question here, because India is almost in the same position, maybe like Europe, between the elephant and the China shop, and it's even closer to the China shop than Europe is. So may I read this out to you? It's how do you see the role of India as an ally for Western democracies after COVID-19?
I think the experience of India since independence in 1947 is very clear. India has no interest in joining entangling alliances. India is very proud of the reality that it tried to choose a third way, the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. So I think the idea that the West, the US and Europe, democracies, US, Europe, and Japan, are somehow going to be able to bring India into an alliance against China is a forlorn expectation. That being said, however, I think that India, especially with this renewed pressure on its border, the fact that there are now Chinese naval warships in the Indian Ocean on a regular basis, the fact that China is allied, one of the few allies it has, is with Pakistan, a much more existential threat in some ways to India because of the whole nuclear issue, means that I think India is going to eventually gravitate towards fellow democracies, rule of law, elements of the West. But I don't think that we should expect to see some kind of grand military alliance, so much as really a community of common principles, of common approaches. The reality is that Indian parliamentarians have more of a say in Indian government than China's National People's Congress does. And that means that there are Indian legislators who share fundamental interests, approaches, views alongside members of the German Bundestag, the House of Commons, and the US Congress.
And I have two other questions concerning Europe. The one is relates to the role of Confucius Institutes. I read that to you. What is the role of Confucius institutions in Europe in the post-COVID era? And the second one, and that also, do you believe that power structure in China would support an intact European Union, or would rather support a breakup? What do you think is was China's rationale when it comes to the European Union?
So the Confucius Institute aspect is perhaps the more straightforward of the two. Confucius Institutes are run through the Chinese government. They are run through something called the Hanban, which, when you look very carefully at how it's funded and how it is structured, it is part of the Chinese government. So these are entities that exist to try and influence, in a very long-term sense, in a truly long-term sense, other countries' views of China. This is not to influence policymakers tomorrow about 5G, COVID-19, Huawei. It is to try and influence college students, and in some cases, high school students, our secondary school system, into having a more positive view of China. They teach the language, nothing wrong with that, but the text that they use, the examples that they use, and then through the funding mechanism, because they give money to their host institution, they then try to also make sure that, for example, Tibetans are not asked to come and speak. Members of Falun Gong are not able to come and speak on campus. So it's a very subtle but clear effort to influence. And so what will the impact of Confucius Institutes be post-COVID-19? To try and teach to European college students, like American college students, China is a friendly country. China is a wonderful place to visit. China provides all sorts of resources. And people who say bad things about China, they have ulterior dark motives. And you shouldn't listen to them. And frankly, you shouldn't let them onto campus. And by the way, you, the administrators, you, the university presidents and trustees, need to think about your bottom line. Do you like receiving these checks from the Chinese government via the Confucius Institute? This goes to, how does China think about the EU, and how does China think about the individual European Union? I think the Chinese recognize that the EU is a reality. Whatever has happened with Brexit, whatever happens with the Greeks and their debt problems, etc., there is a European Union. China is not necessarily going to go out there and push to try and end the European Union, because it is a fact of life. What is it Deng Xiaoping said? Seek truth from facts. But, one, so long as the EU is consensus-based, it requires all of its members to agree to something, then in many ways, it is a wonderful mechanism for China to prevent the creation, ironically, of European-wide institutions. For example, the idea of a European complement to the American Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, an entity that can legally review any acquisition of, by a foreign power, of domestic companies. And the US CFIUS has stopped Chinese efforts to acquire microchips, aircraft manufacturers, key infrastructure sites. EU efforts to create a common European entity like that have been blocked. And I would suggest that China knows how to manipulate smaller players within the European context to oppose the creation of such bodies. A patchwork of CFIUS equivalents at the national level is not something China welcomes. It would rather have no CFIUS at all anywhere. But a patchwork does allow China to then exploit loopholes, to perhaps acquire items via country L that doesn't have a CFIUS, where it could import goods from a country that does. So China inevitably is trying to apply the reality of being the second largest economy and one of the two most populous countries against other players, whether it is individually or as a group. It takes things as they are. If you are a union, it will figure out what the union rules are that it can exploit to weaken it. And if it is individually, it will play individual parts. It will do both. I mean, that is perhaps the third thing. Beyond persistence and consistency, one of the other things is that the Chinese can walk and chew gum at the same time. One of the things that definitely for the US government has often been a challenge.
Benno, please.
If I may, you mentioned like with Confucius Institutes, we hinted at more positive, maybe less political element of the same thing.
I think that is it rogue? I doubt very much that it is rogue behavior, simply because these diplomats haven't been released. The Chinese system is rather unforgiving, or can be, when people step beyond the line. This is why, for example, the China-India tension, well, could these military people be doing this on their own? Hot dog pilots, and that does happen. It does, in reality, happen in any military, for example. You choose fighter pilots because of their aggressiveness. So the 2001 EP3 incident almost certainly was a case of a pilot who was going beyond their authorization, misjudged, and died as a result. But what we don't see is the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson using Twitter, and this is very important to remember. If you are Chinese, you cannot have a Twitter account. So for a Chinese Foreign Ministry official to use an official Twitter account is not to signal his own domestic population because they can't read it. That is an official method of communications, and he was never reprimanded for it. So we can put the rogue part aside. I do think that there are a couple of things at work here. I think one of this is that Chinese diplomats, now that they represent the #2 economy in the world, a country with growing capability, are tired of taking a very receding role. I think they feel, why should I shut my mouth? Other countries, far smaller economies, they have no problem lecturing us. Why can't we lecture them? I think a second part to this is the fascinating aspect of Chinese bureaucracy. I mentioned Yang Jiechi earlier. He is now the state counselor for foreign affairs. He is the first Chinese foreign policy person to be on the Politburo since 1999. This is very important to recognize, is that in the Chinese political system, the foreign minister is not automatically on the Politburo. This is different from the Soviets. It's different actually from the Mao era, when Zhou Enlai was both foreign minister and prime minister. So for almost 20 years, Chinese foreign policy was not dictated by the Chinese Foreign Ministry. It was dictated by other people on the Politburo who may or may not have had any foreign policy experience at all. So in a sense, bureaucratically, with Yang Jiechi being elevated to the Politburo in 2017, Chinese Foreign Ministry people are now much more serious in the bureaucratic fights and are able to be heard. And third, and this is something I think is understudied, is generational shift. If you look at the Chinese ambassador to France, who authored that appalling letter about French nursing home workers abandoning their charges, if you look at the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson who accused the U.S. of spreading COVID-19, if you look at the Chinese official in Sweden, I think it was their ambassador, who basically said, that Sweden is a welterweight taking on a heavyweight. These people are all in an age range that suggests that they were born just before or right after the Cultural Revolution. So they came of age with a China that has always been rising, that has always been a member of the UN P5, which has always been at least a part of the G20, whose opinions are sought after because China, and whose investments are sought. So generationally speaking, they are the wolf warrior generation. And they, I think, are therefore, even if they weren't representing the number 2 economy in the world, they simply have a different outlook from their parents and their grandparents. And certainly from Xi Jinping, who it should be noted, is of directly the previous generation. So he lived through the Cultural Revolution as someone who was sent to the countries that were of that generation. So that's a very different perspective. So I think it's these multiple different factors all coming together.
These questions through Slido coming in. So I have another one what role do you see Chinese technology companies like Huawei play in the Chinese foreign policy in Europe?
When the Chinese were let into the WTO 25 years ago, the belief was that Chinese corporations would influence the Chinese Communist Party. That companies want to make money. And companies like Huawei, which are private, they are not state-owned enterprises, were clearly going to be a means of effecting economic liberalization, if not political. 25 years later, we can now see that that was a fundamentally wrong judgment. That Chinese companies, whether they're state-owned, Sinopec, CNOOC, etc., Costco, CSSC, or private, Huawei, Alibaba, they obey the party. And so the role of Chinese technology companies in Europe is several things. One, if possible, win contracts to build out Europe's information communications technology. And why? I do believe that it is a malign effort, that things like BGP alterations, it means that if Chinese companies build out your 5G network, then eventually they will have the ability to redirect the internet and all the trazzles over it back to China. It is an effort, I think, also to acquire technology. Chinese companies have, China has tried to buy, both through companies and governmentally, key high technology areas, Dutch chip manufacturing machines, German robotics, other, radars, aerospace systems. So I think that aspect. And third, finally, Chinese private companies in particular recognize that they can play a role in influence, whether it is through lobbying, whether it is through joining industrial standards groups, whether it is simply through the direction of investment. Chinese investments in Europe are different from BRI. They are intended to make money, but therefore they are also very large in amount, and that eventually shapes foreign policy. If China is willing to invest, whether by company or by state-owned enterprise, billions of dollars in your economy, it probably is going to gain some influence in your respective parliaments and prime minister's office.
We have quite an active audience today on Slido, so I have two more. Is there a movement amongst the younger generation within China to change the political construct which prohibits the establishment of a civil society? That's question number one. And the other one has to do with the Chinese youth. and that is, but it relates to the United States. And my question, the second question is, for also coming from Slido audience, is President Trump said that visas for Chinese students in the United States should not be extended. What do you think? Is that a good or a bad idea?
Promise I will try to answer the second question, but let me just note here, there are many, many days lately that I'm glad I analyzed China and not the United States. Chinese civil society. The first thing, unfortunately, to realize is that the issue of civil society is one that was limited even before the creation of the People's Republic of China. There was never independent religion, ecclesiastic authority, the way that the Catholic Church and Protestant churches were independent of the state in Europe. So that's the first aspect. The second is there efforts to create civil society? It's not clear the extent to which younger people recognize the importance and role of civil society in China. It's sort of like trying to explain to a blind person the color orange. That being said, there are efforts, for example, house churches. People are trying to create church religious organizations apart from the state. They face enormous pressure. They are cracked down upon. The Uyghurs, of course, the latest revelation is that the Chinese government has engaged in mass sterilization of Uyghurs, based on partly ethnicity, but also certainly religion. When Chinese students go abroad, it's important to recognize that while many don't go home, and part of that is the desire for greater freedom, the enjoyment of civil society, whether in Europe, in Japan, in the United States, or Canada, most do go home. It is still a majority go home. And so they understand that there is a difference. That may change if the CCP is unable to ensure economic growth, job security, political security. Those are things that would alter the effect. This goes to the issue of visas. There is this unfortunate tendency to use too broad a brush. Not every Chinese student is a spy. Not every Chinese company is malevolently seeking out your personal information and shipping it back to China to go into some giant AI database. The problem is that the Chinese government has the ability to make companies do that and to pressure students. So students who go to, the Sorbonne or to Oxford or Duke may well not go there intending to acquire information other than an education. But if you wind up working on something that the Chinese government thinks is interesting, they will put pressure on it. And it's not as though you have many alternative answers, especially if you want to go home. So I understand why the US is cracking down on the visa issue for the Chinese. I think that this is a sledgehammer, and that is not something you want to use for brain surgery. But at the moment, that is the first set of tools. I would like to think that eventually we will come up with a more precise set of mechanisms. But so long as the Chinese government is able to pressure individual students and individual as well as companies to do its bidding, that this tool unfortunately needs to at least exist. Whether it is employed and how often it is employed is a different issue. But the Chinese very clearly are doing things that force us into taking such drastic measures.
And the next question also comes through Slido. You see anti-Chinese sentiment growing in Europe and the United States, and how can this be avoided while increasing caution against Chinese influence?
I think that, sorry, I do apologize. Sorry. Sorry about this. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. So, okay. One of the great problems of working from home is that we have more limited control over incoming calls. Anti-Chinese sentiment is, I think, inevitably going to be caused by a combination of two separate strands. One are policy issues, where it isn't so much anti-China as it is self-defense and self-protection. I don't think anyone is actively trying to overthrow the People's Republic of China or the Chinese Communist Party. But unfortunately, we have a Chinese system that challenges our understanding of security. And a CCP that views self-protection, that views efforts to limit Chinese access as quote-unquote anti-China. Unfortunately, alongside that is racial and ethnocentric attitudes that view China as a problem simply because of who they are. And that we do need to unwind these two separate strands. How do we oppose China without being anti-China? And I think the answer to that has to reside in learning more about China, learning more about China in terms of learning the language, reading their material, so that when we challenge the Chinese, it isn't by falling back on racial or ethnic stereotypes. It isn't falling back on well, you know, you can't trust those people. It is, here is what they have said, here's what they have done, and this is how it contradicts our security interests. That being said, this is why we are opposing it. And we need to come up with, hopefully, workable answers that aren't, and therefore we will seal you off from the rest of the world and wait until you die. Containment worked with the Soviets because they were autarkic, they were economically uninterested in trading with others. You cannot really contain the world's largest trading power. So identifying how China is doing things, in a sense, wrong, and offering a better solution is part of opposing China without being anti-China.
Benno, please. And I want to tell you that the audience has been complaining a little bit about this, about the sound from your side. So please make sure that your microphone is close to your, to your mouth, so we can hear your voice loud and clear. Thanks.
Okay, I'll try. It's the usual issues with this technology. We're all used to it, sadly, by now. My question is that the debate, particularly about technology and economics in Europe, very much revolves around 5G, which you have mentioned, the issue of banning or not banning Huawei. Very often, the entire debate boils down to that. So since this is so prominent, are there other issues that we're completely missing out on in the European debate, that blind spots? Are these other investments that you mentioned in other sectors, whether Chinese companies are running European ports or acquiring certain niche companies, are these more important? Is this 5G issue overblown? What are we missing out on?
And Benno, if I may, I just want to jump in with another question we got through Slido from our audience, and let me read that to you. It has to do with your question. The Swiss MIT, that's the ETH in Zurich, uses Huawei for Wi-Fi infrastructure. Do you think that this is a potential threat to Swiss intellectual property?
Well, let me address the Swiss question first. Yes. I mean, that's just very straightforward. Is Huawei, openly just sucking up all of the Swiss MIT's technology and shipping it back to China? Not necessarily. But Huawei very clearly has engaged in intellectual property theft, often very basic physical things like stealing a robot hand that was used to test cell phone surfaces. That wasn't cyber, that was outright theft by a Huawei technician. So yes, I think that there is potential there. Keep in mind, when a company installs a system, it will have access simply because that company is now responsible for updates and upgrades and system maintenance. So you cannot keep that vendor out. So the question becomes, does that vendor nonetheless respect your intellectual property? Huawei has a demonstrated track record, unfortunately, of being questionable in that regard. Is 5G overblown? I think Benno's question is, it is not overblown, but it is the thing that has sucked the oxygen out of the room. 5G will be the nervous system of the future. The fact of the matter is that we are having this conversation right now by teleconference, which is an enormous amount of bandwidth. Think about how many conferences, meetings we now do by telecom, how much bandwidth is required. Think about all the movies that are already streamed just so that you and your children don't drive each other crazy under quarantine. That is bandwidth. 5G has already gone from really nice to have, and eventually we'll figure out what to do with it, to I need this now. And Huawei is echoing that. But it isn't just 5G. Railway technology is one of the more boring items out there. But without railways, goods don't move. And China has said very clearly it wants to dominate global railway technology. That means locomotives, but it also is switching technology, which is, of course, electronics, etc. You mentioned running ports. Running ports is, in and of itself, not necessarily intellectual property and high-end technology, but it is intelligence gathering. It is knowing which containers are going where. It is the ability, if you shut down Rotterdam and Antwerp and Marseille, you are going to devastate European trade just right off the bat. If I have access to both your railway and your port switching technology and cargo handling capacity, think about what I could do if I were a malign actor. So right there, and Chinese companies will do what the Chinese state demands. That is where these other technologies, I think, become very worrisome.
I have another question coming through Slido, and that's more on diplomatic, let's say, style. Let me read that to you. Michael Ferry is asking the question, saving face and respect are very important elements in China, Miangxi and Guangxi. Should this aspect be taken into account more when confronting Chinese politics?
Only if you know what you're doing. And the problem here, with all due respect to the questioner, this is not to denigrate the questioner, but too often people raise the idea of saving face without understanding the intricacies of it. The reality is that for most intents and purposes, we cannot cause the Chinese leadership to lose face, because face is also partly a measure of relationship that already exists. And we simply do not have the kind of relationship with the Chinese in terms of leaders or as nations that we can manipulate the issue of face. Let me give you a quick example. In 2015, Xi Jinping met with President Obama. He committed China to not militarize the South China Sea. And a number of analysts said, oh, this absolutely means the Chinese will stop what they are doing in the South China Sea, because Xi Jinping made this promise publicly to President Obama. If he is seen as violating it, he will lose face. Well, in fact, the Chinese went ahead and militarized the South China Sea. Could this happen? Because Xi Jinping did not owe face to Barack Obama. He's another leader, but the relationship was never equal from the Chinese perspective. So Xi Jinping could lose face to Li Keqiang, or to Wang Qishan, or to Yang Jiechi. But to lose face to a foreigner based on making a promise or a commitment implies a level of relationship to begin with that I'm not sure the Chinese have with anyone. And again, another quick example. China has in the past promised that North Korea would not develop nuclear weapons. North Korea has nuclear weapons. I'm not sure Deng Xiaoping lost face. I'm not sure that Jiang Zemin lost face. I'm not sure Hu Jintao has lost face. And I certainly don't think Xi Jinping has lost face because of what Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, or Kim Jong-un has done. And they actually have relationships that are arguably in some ways deeper than that of any Western leader with the Chinese leader.
Thank you very much. Dean, we are now actually, it's 5 o'clock Viennese time here, Central European time. Do you have a few more minutes for us? Is it possible to?
I would be happy to.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. So again, I have another Slido question. I keep seeing recent headlines in European news that Europe can't count on the United States as a superpower anymore. Does this mean that Europe is looking more towards China? That's one question that came in from anonymously through our Slido.
This is why I'm happier analyzing China than I am the United States. We have a president who has a very, very different view of transatlantic relations than most previous presidents. Let me note here that he has often been described as transactional, and I regret to say that there's a lot of truth to that. But if you want to see transactional relationships at the end of the day, look at China. Look at how China basically says, if I give you personal protective equipment in the middle of a pandemic, you now owe me. Not only that, but I do not owe you, this goes, by the way, back to that whole face question previously. I do not owe you the most basic information about COVID-19 because you have no call upon me. You have no place in our relationship to make that demand upon me. So is the relationship with the US uncomfortable these days? I regret to say it is. But if you want to know what it is like to be treated as an appendage, get in bed with China. Can Europe depend upon the United States? I think that President Trump, unfortunately, has in his mind, which he sometimes may or may not share with others, certain expectations. I think in particular, he expects Germany to spend more on defense. By the way, this is not just about Europe. He expects South Korea to be less interested in getting in bed with North Korea. I think that these constant demands for more spending on defense are not simply how much did you promise at the Lisbon Agreement or at a previous summit, Wales, etc., so much as what are you doing with the people you say you are worried about? And in the case of Germany, it is a willingness to work with Russia that I think leaves him wondering, if you are willing to work with Russia or South Korea, if you are willing to work with North Korea, why am I defending you? You'll notice that he is prickly and difficult to get along with, even with traditional allies like Great Britain, but less so with countries like Japan, which he has written very negatively about, or Poland. So I think that there is more to it than just peak, more to it than just you're not spending enough. I think there is a question, perhaps, of if you say you are feeling threatened, do you act like you are feeling threatened? And if not, then what is it you expect from the United States while you act like you're not threatened?
Benno, do you have maybe one last question? No? Then let me maybe also go with my last question coming again from Slido. And that goes back to the topic of our discussion, the post-COVID world, and that goes right into the COVID topic, and that is China. Let me read that again. It's from an anonymous participant of the Slido, and that's China opened its first BSL-4 lab in 2015 in Wuhan, and the second in 2018 in Harbin. Do you think there is sufficient oversight to maintain global trust when it comes to these labs?
Well, certainly in terms of global oversight, the answer is no. China is probably the most opaque, one of the most opaque countries out there. It's not as opaque as North Korea, but China very clearly does not feel obligated to share information. Let me note here, the genetic map of COVID-19 that was released by the Shanghai Public Health Facility was apparently not authorized by the Chinese government. It apparently was released to partners of that facility, and the facility was then shut down, and as far as I know, has not been reopened since it was revealed that they had shared that information in an unauthorized way. So, but that being said, I do want to note here that in talking to at least some microbiologists and others, they all seem pretty unanimous that COVID-19 is not a biowarfare experiment gone wrong. And it is also important to note here that China, a nation of 1.3 billion people, has many, many labs and many, many places. Just in Wuhan, there is another lab that belongs to the Communicable Disease Center, sort of like our CDC, that does research in bat viruses from a purely public health perspective. So when people say it escaped from a lab, they often mean that they seem to imply the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the BSL-4 facility, when there are other facilities as well. There's also multiple universities in Wuhan, many of which have biology departments that may also have done experiments. So, but this is part of the problem. We don't have insight. And by the way, the institute in Harbin almost certainly is part of the military complex, because the Chinese themselves have multiple different university systems. You have the classic universities of Tsinghua and Beida and Renmin Daxue, et cetera. But you also have the Beijing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics, the Harbin Institute of Technology. Those are part of the military-industrial complex, apart from the Ministry of Education. So again, understanding this very complex and not well documented, certainly in English, structure is important in trying to get our arms around what kind of things might China be doing.
I have one more, that's coming from Heinz Gärtner here. He's from Vienna. The question is, should the United States ally with Russia against China or with China against Russia? And the second part of the question is war of the United States against China inevitable?
Let me address the second question first. There is a fairly popular book on this side of the Atlantic by Graham Allison about the Thucydides trap.
He's referring to that as well in the question.
What I would say about the Thucydides trap is the following. There is a very odd aspect here, which is, you know something, the Chinese aren't Greek. The Thucydides trap relies on falling back, of course, on the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, which is fundamental to Western culture, is about the balance of a land power against a maritime power between two great powers. As I said earlier, China comes from an Asian history that is fundamentally different. So it would be about as likely to make sense to reduce the US-China relationship to the Thucydides trap as for a Chinese scholar to reduce the US-China-Russia relationship to the warring Three Kingdoms period. Who gets to play Cao Cao? And so I think, is it inevitable? No, but not because of Thucydides or anything else, but because we are, Henry Kissinger once said, when he took over as Secretary of State, we will not repeat the mistakes of my predecessors. We will make all new mistakes. I think that what we will see is problems in the US-China relationship that are not direct parallels to any previous conflict. You can, first off, US-China-Russia elevates Russia arguably in ways that Russia frankly doesn't deserve. Russia's economy is the size of Belgium's, maybe Italy on a good day. It relies entirely on exports of commodities and weapons. And by commodities, really oil, which is going for, I think, $40 a barrel right now. I would much prefer to think of the EU, with all of its vagaries, as far more of a meaningful pole, population-wise, technology-wise, economy-wise, than the Russians. The Russians have lots of nuclear weapons. One has to pay attention to that. But that being said, this is not a choice. Russia is not a reliable ally. And Russia's demands for any kind of anti-China move, assuming it was willing to do that in the first place, would inevitably mean sacrificing major democracies, fellow democracies, the Baltics to begin with, a Russian free hand in Ukraine, a Russian right to redraw the map of Europe despite the Helsinki Accords. Think of the ugliness that would emerge if European borders were to be subjected to this kind of rewriting. As for China, we've talked already, I think, at length about the Chinese challenge. I think from an American's perspective, this American's perspective, I do not speak for President Trump, I think that it is far more important to think about how the US, Europe, Canada, Japan, South Korea, even India, as democracies can coordinate our policies to face, frankly, the new authoritarianism that we see in Moscow and in Beijing, and sadly in other places like Tehran. Because the trumpet never was truly laid down. The challenge remains. How do people organize themselves? What is the balance between the individual and the state? Is there a place for civil society? Neither Moscow nor Beijing sees a place for civil society the way we do. And there may be tactical moments of alignment of interest, momentary, but in the longer term, it is among the traditional democracies that we share principles and ultimately interests.
And this, I think, will be the last question. We have many, many more. I'm really grateful for a very active audience today. And that one comes from Roberto Ettinger Mendoza. And his question is Hong Kong the new Berlin? And he's asking why so few governments are weighing in, putting pressure on China when it comes to Hong Kong. Are they afraid of the possible economic consequences if they're siding with Hong Kong?
I'm afraid Hong Kong is not the new Berlin. Hong Kong is perhaps the new Karl Marxstadt, by which I mean that the Allied powers had a right legally to be in Berlin. We were prepared to risk war, and we demonstrated it many times over Berlin. Hong Kong is part of China. The Sino-UK agreement, joint declaration, guaranteed that Hong Kong would be left alone, which China has violated. But Hong Kong was Chinese territory, ceded by treaties under the Opium War, and reverted back. Taiwan may be the new Berlin. Taiwan may be the place where the two sides face each other off. And Taiwan, in some ways, is more sovereign than West Berlin ever was. Yes, the Chinese very clearly are able to browbeat others into not criticizing China over Hong Kong. They are about to announce, if they haven't already, from the National People's Congress, a new national security law, which will effectively gut Hong Kong as an autonomous entity. The US has said that we are now going to treat Hong Kong as part of China in terms of access, in terms of tariffs, in terms of everything else. It will remain to be seen whether the rest of Europe, for example, chooses to follow along that path, or whether it chooses to treat Hong Kong as some kind of separate entity. I would like to think that people will criticize the Chinese government for its behavior, both in terms of treaty obligations and also at a personal human rights level, how it treats Hong Kong. I hope so. But at the end of the day, our political and legal rights to Hong Kong are very different from those that were available to us in Berlin. And I regret to say that that means that our ability to influence China is far less.
And this question comes from Linda Ostuki from Vienna also. What is known about China, a Chinese nuclear weapons arsenal? Do we have to fear another nuclear arms race?
The good news here is no. If you think back to the Cold War, and that's when I cut my teeth on strategic analysis, the US and Soviet Union had thousands of ICBMs, hundreds to thousands of submarine-launched ballistic missiles. We had something on the order of 10,000 warheads each, plus bomber-based things. The Chinese have gone for what is termed a minimal deterrent, basically several hundred strategic nuclear warheads that can basically reach 8,000 to 12,000 miles. We're not so clear about how many tactical level nuclear warheads they have. That may be in the thousands, but even there will be in the low thousands. Again, to give you a sense of comparison, the US and Russia under the last arms control treaties each have about 1,500 long-range ICBM-type nuclear warheads range-wise. The Russians have thousands and thousands of tactical nuclear weapons. The United States gave up most of those at the end of the Cold War. So China sees nuclear weapons as important from a political perspective. We need to have some. Sees them important from a deterrence perspective. We want to be sure that anyone who attacks us will regret it very much. But doesn't seem to have a nuclear warfighting strategy of counterforce targeting the other side's nuclear weapons. Also does not seem to feel a need for multiple redundant, assured destruction capacity. If they're sure that they can destroy your top 25 cities at least once, I think that they're fairly happy with that. It is, however, important to note, China feels it is faced with multiple independent nuclear threats in a way that the US has not, and even the Soviet Union did not. What I mean by that is China has to worry about an American nuclear attack. It has to worry about a Russian nuclear attack, separate from, not in coordination with, the Americans. It has to worry about an Indian nuclear attack, separate from the Russians and the Americans. And because of their long history, China is always going to be wondering, does Japan have a nuclear bomb in the basement? Could it develop nuclear weapons in short order? And would that be a Japan that was now totally separate from the United States? So this is also, again, a somewhat different strategic view, but nonetheless, no, we don't seem to see a Chinese expectation of building thousands of ICBMs, SLBMs, bombers, etc. But they are modernizing their nuclear force. They are building very capable new nuclear weapons. So it's no reason to be complacent.
Dean, thank you so much. And now there is the uncomfortable part of my role as a moderator here, because I have to apologize to a lot of people here on the Slido. We cannot do all the questions. I'm really sorry. I have to apologize to you, Dean, that I took more of your time than we had originally agreed. I'm really grateful that you took out the time. I think it was really well worth it. We had a great discussion. I have to apologize to Benno, because also we have sitting yesterday, put a long list of questions that we wanted to ask you. I think we don't even have a third of them. But I wanted to give the opportunity to our audience here. So thank you, everybody. Thanks a lot. Thanks from Vienna. Thanks to the wonderful audience. Really, these questions still coming in. Thanks a lot. And again, thanks to you, Dean. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I hope we will have a chance to do this again, either electronically or in person.
Thanks, Benno. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.